By the middle of the 1st century before Christ, the Roman Republic stood unrivaled in the Mediterranean world. From the windswept coasts of Hispania to the wealthy cities of the Greek East, from North Africa's grain fields to the rising frontiers of Gaul, Rome's authority extended across continents. Its legions had defeated Carthage, subdued Macedon, crushed pirates, and absorbed kingdoms that had once seemed eternal. Wealth poured into Italy in staggering quantities: silver from Iberian mines, slaves from conquered territories, tribute from subject provinces. Marble temples rose where modest shrines had once stood. Roads stitched together vast distances. The Republic appeared invincible, disciplined, and destined to rule without end. Yet beneath this surface of order and triumph, the very foundations of Roman governance were straining under the weight of expansion. The Republic had been designed for a city-state, not for an empire. Its political system depended on balance: magistrates limited by annual terms, generals bound by civilian authority, senators competing but constrained by tradition. Conquest altered that equilibrium. Armies now campaigned for years far from Italy, forging personal loyalty to commanders rather than to the Senate. Provincial commands brought immense wealth and influence to individual men. Political competition in Rome grew sharper, fueled by ambition and fear in equal measure. The same victories that secured Rome's dominance also concentrated power in ways its institutions were never meant to absorb. In this environment emerged figures of extraordinary stature. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, celebrated as Rome's greatest general, and Gaius Julius Caesar, ambitious, calculating, and relentlessly capable. They were not aberrations in an otherwise stable system. They were its logical outcome. Each had risen through military success. Each commanded the loyalty of hardened legions. Each depended on political survival in a city increasingly divided between factions that saw compromise as weakness. The rivalry that would later consume the Republic did not begin as inevitable hatred between two men, but as a symptom of structural imbalance. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean, but it could not govern the consequences of conquest. The civil war that followed was not merely a clash of personalities. It was the moment when a republic built on shared restraint confronted forces it no longer had the means to restrain. The crisis that would erupt into open war did not begin on a battlefield, but within the slow corrosion of Rome's political equilibrium. The Republic's institutions had been forged in an era when its magistrates governed a compact Italian sphere, when campaigns were seasonal and generals returned swiftly to civilian life. Expansion altered these rhythms. Provinces required long-term oversight, armies remained under arms for years, and commanders accumulated not only glory, but wealth vast enough to rival the state itself. Soldiers who once fought as temporary citizen levies increasingly became professionals in all but name, bound by shared hardship and rewarded by their general's success. Loyalty, once anchored in the Senate and people of Rome, began to migrate toward individuals capable of delivering land, spoils, and security. The old constitutional balance, annual offices, collegial authority, mutual veto, remained in form, yet its spirit was steadily eroding under pressures it had never been designed to withstand. Political competition in the capital sharpened as the stakes of command grew higher. Electoral contests were no longer pathways to modest honor, but gateways to immense provincial power. Alliances shifted, debts mounted, and ambition demanded protection. In this atmosphere emerged the informal compact later known as the First Triumvirate, an arrangement not sanctioned by law but sustained by mutual advantage. Gaius Julius Caesar, seeking the consulship and a significant command, aligned himself with Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, whose eastern victories had made him Rome's most celebrated general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose wealth rivaled any treasury. Each brought something essential: Pompey military prestige and veterans in need of settlement, Crassus financial resources and influence, Caesar political dexterity and popular appeal. Together they bypassed senatorial resistance and redistributed authority through private agreement, revealing how fragile formal structures had become when confronted by concentrated personal power. For a time, this uneasy coalition stabilized competition by containing it within shared interest. Caesar secured a proconsular command in Gaul, where over nearly a decade he would wage campaigns that expanded Rome's frontiers and, more importantly, bound hardened legions to his leadership. Pompey remained in Rome, his status elevated yet increasingly dependent on the Senate's favor. Crassus sought glory in the east, but his catastrophic defeat and death at Carrhae shattered the balance that had restrained rivalry. With one pillar removed, the arrangement collapsed into suspicion. Pompey, once Caesar's ally and even his son-in-law, drifted toward the senatorial elite who feared Caesar's growing power. The Senate itself fractured between those who believed accommodation necessary and those who saw in Caesar a threat to republican liberty. Legal debates over commands in imperium masked deeper anxieties. Could a man who commanded devoted legions and commanded the loyalty of an entire province ever return to private citizenship without destabilizing the state? As Caesar's term in Gaul neared its end, the underlying contradiction became unavoidable. Roman law required a general to surrender his imperium before entering Italy, rendering him a private citizen vulnerable to prosecution. For Caesar, whose political enemies were numerous and determined, relinquishing command meant exposure. For his opponents, allowing him to retain it threatened precedent and balance. Pompey, now aligned with the senatorial majority, was granted extraordinary authority to defend the Republic should Caesar refuse compliance. The language of legality persisted, yet the substance of compromise had evaporated. What had begun as competition within a shared framework hardened into a contest over survival and legitimacy. Rome's institutions, stretched by decades of expansion and personalized command, could no longer reconcile ambition with restraint. The Republic stood outwardly intact, but its mechanisms of balance had become instruments of confrontation, and the strain that had accumulated across generations was narrowing toward a single, decisive rupture. By the winter of 50 BCE, the political standoff had hardened into a crisis that could no longer be contained within speeches and decrees. The Senate, urged on by factions determined to curtail Caesar's influence, demanded that he relinquish his command in Gaul and return to Rome as a private citizen. The order was framed as a defense of republican legality, a reaffirmation that no magistrate stood above the law. Yet behind the language of principle lay calculation and fear. Caesar's campaigns had transformed him into one of the wealthiest and most celebrated men in the Roman world. His legions were not temporary levies but veterans forged through years of shared hardship, bound to him by loyalty that transcended formal obligation. To dismiss them and step into Rome unprotected was to trust entirely in the mercy of political rivals who had shown little inclination toward restraint. Caesar sought compromise, proposing that both he and Pompey lay down their commands simultaneously, preserving parity and avoiding humiliation for either side. The proposal was rejected. Pompey, increasingly positioned as the Republic's defender, had been granted authority to safeguard Italy. The Senate issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree empowering magistrates to take whatever measures were necessary to protect the state. In effect, the Republic armed itself against one of its own proconsuls. The legal boundary between province and homeland, once a clear line demarcating military authority, now became the axis of decision. North of the small river Rubicon, Caesar retained imperium. South of it lay Italy, where bringing an army without authorization constituted rebellion. The choice before him was stark. Obedience meant political annihilation and possible exile or worse. Defiance meant civil war against a state he claimed to defend. In January of 49 BCE, Caesar advanced to the banks of the Rubicon with a single legion. The act that followed was less dramatic in spectacle than in consequence. There was no grand battle, no immediate clash of armies, only a commander stepping across a shallow river that marked the limits of lawful power. Yet the symbolism was unmistakable. By leading troops into Italy, Caesar transformed political conflict into armed confrontation. The Republic's internal mechanisms had failed. Force would decide what law could not. The speed of subsequent events revealed how deeply the system had fractured. Towns across Italy opened their gates with little resistance. Pompey, assessing the balance of forces, chose not to defend the peninsula directly. His strength lay in the eastern provinces, where fleets and resources could be marshaled on a scale far greater than Caesar's initial incursion. He withdrew southward and then across the Adriatic to Greece, intending to regroup and wage war from a position of logistical superiority. The evacuation of Rome by its own leading magistrates underscored the gravity of the rupture. The capital fell without a major fight, not because the conflict lacked intensity, but because both sides understood that the struggle would not be settled in its streets. As Caesar secured Italy, he moved swiftly to stabilize grain supplies, reassure citizens, and frame his actions as a defense against oligarchic oppression. Propaganda accompanied maneuver, each side claiming legitimacy. Yet beneath proclamations lay a new reality. Roman legions would now face one another not as instruments of expansion, but as adversaries in a contest for the state itself. The Mediterranean, once unified under Roman conquest, became the theater of an internal reckoning. What had begun as constitutional strain had crossed into open war, and the Republic, long sustained by shared assumptions of restraint, entered a phase where survival depended not on debate within the Senate, but on victory in the field. Once the struggle moved beyond Italy, the scale of the conflict expanded dramatically. Pompey's withdrawal to the eastern provinces was not an act of surrender, but a strategic calculation grounded in geography and resources. The East had long been the reservoir of Roman wealth and manpower. Client kings, allied cities, and vast treasuries stood within reach of his authority. More importantly, Pompey controlled the sea. His fleets dominated the Adriatic, complicating any attempt by Caesar to transport his legions into Greece. On land, Caesar possessed hardened veterans. At sea, he was vulnerable. The war now became a contest not only of courage and command, but of logistics, endurance, and timing. In early 48 before Christ, Caesar crossed the Adriatic with a fraction of his forces, gambling on speed before Pompey could concentrate his superior numbers. Storms scattered transports, supplies ran thin, and for a time Caesar's army operated under severe shortages, cut off from reinforcement. Pompey, cautious by temperament and urged by senators who had joined him in exile, avoided decisive engagement. His advantage lay in attrition. With larger forces and control of supply lines, he could afford patience. Many among his supporters believed time itself would defeat Caesar, whose men were exhausted and undersupplied in hostile territory. The campaign in Greece unfolded as a tense maneuvering of armies across rugged terrain. Fortifications rose and fell. Skirmishes tested resolve. At Dyrrhachium, Pompey achieved a significant tactical success, nearly trapping Caesar's forces and inflicting heavy losses. For a moment, the possibility of Caesar's defeat appeared real, yet Pompey hesitated to press the advantage fully, wary of overextension and confident that scarcity would weaken his rival. Caesar, recognizing the danger of being worn down, withdrew into Thessaly, forcing Pompey to pursue. The decision to engage more aggressively marked a shift in the war's tempo. Pressure from senators eager for a swift conclusion mounted. Confidence in numerical superiority grew. The armies finally met near the town of Pharsalus in the summer of 48 before Christ. Pompey commanded a force significantly larger than Caesar's, with more cavalry and fresh recruits drawn from across the eastern provinces. Caesar's legions, though fewer, were veterans of Gaul and hardened by continuous campaigning. Pompey arranged his troops to absorb an attack, intending to let Caesar's lines exhaust themselves before counterattacking with overwhelming cavalry on the flank. Caesar, anticipating this maneuver, concealed an additional line of infantry behind his right wing, instructing them to target the cavalry directly. When the battle commenced, the clash was brutal and immediate. Pompey's cavalry initially pushed back Caesar's horsemen, but the hidden infantry advanced with disciplined ferocity, breaking the charge and sending the mounted forces into retreat. The collapse of the cavalry exposed Pompey's flank and unraveled the cohesion of his army. What followed was decisive. Caesar's legions pressed forward, exploiting gaps and maintaining formation under intense pressure. Pompey's lines faltered, then dissolved into flight. The scale of the defeat was catastrophic for the senatorial cause. Thousands were killed or captured. Many of the Republic's leading figures fell into Caesar's hands. Pompey himself fled the field, seeking refuge across the Mediterranean and Egypt, where he hoped to regroup and perhaps rekindle resistance with new alliances. Instead, he encountered betrayal. Upon landing, he was assassinated by agents of the young king Ptolemy, who believed that presenting Pompey's head to Caesar would secure favor. The gesture misjudged both the political moment and Caesar's response. Pompey had been rival and adversary, but he was also a Roman consul and former ally. His death marked not reconciliation, but the grim finality of a civil struggle that had consumed its most powerful defender of the old order. With Pompey gone, organized resistance did not vanish immediately, yet its unifying figure had disappeared. The psychological impact was profound. The war was no longer a duel between equals. It became a campaign of consolidation. Caesar moved swiftly to secure Egypt, then turned toward remaining pockets of opposition in North Africa and Hispania. The Mediterranean, once the stage of a balanced contest, now tilted decisively toward one man. Pharsalus had not merely been a military victory, it had shattered the illusion that the Republic could restore equilibrium through compromise or shared command. The outcome suggested a harsher truth. In a system where personal armies and concentrated power had replaced collective restraint, conflict would not end in negotiation, but in dominance. The defeat of Pompey signaled that the Republic's fate would no longer be decided by its Senate, but by the authority of the victor who stood above it. Pompey's death did not bring peace to the Roman world. It removed the last figure capable of rallying the old Republican order under a single banner. What followed was not reconciliation, but consolidation. Caesar moved from Egypt into further campaigns with relentless efficiency, securing grain supplies along the Nile, intervening in dynastic struggles, and ensuring that Rome's economic lifelines remained intact. From there, he turned west and south, confronting surviving senatorial forces in North Africa and later in Hispania. Each victory narrowed the space in which opposition could operate. What had begun as a conflict between rival commanders evolved into a systematic dismantling of organized resistance. The Mediterranean, once divided by competing claims of legitimacy, increasingly answered to a single authority. Yet military triumph alone could not stabilize Rome. The deeper question remained unresolved. What form of government would follow a civil war that had shattered republican balance? Caesar returned to Italy not as a victorious consul among peers, but as the dominant political force in the Roman world. He accepted successive dictatorships, offices traditionally designed as temporary emergency measures, each renewal extending his control. Ultimately, he was named dictator in perpetuity, a title that signaled permanence where once there had been limitation. The Republic's institutions continued to function in appearance. Magistrates were elected, the Senate convened, laws were debated, but the distribution of power had shifted irreversibly. Decisions radiated outward from one center. Caesar embarked on a program of reforms aimed at stabilizing a fractured society. He settled veterans on land, restructured debt, expanded the Senate's membership, reformed the calendar, and initiated public works designed to employ the urban poor. Provincial administration was reorganized to curb corruption and impose greater consistency. These measures were not arbitrary. They addressed structural problems long ignored or exacerbated by decades of elite rivalry. In many respects, Caesar sought to impose order where competition had produced paralysis. Yet reform carried its own dangers. By concentrating authority in his hands, even for pragmatic ends, he diminished the symbolic and practical relevance of shared governance. The Senate, swollen in number but reduced in influence, became increasingly ornamental. Honors accumulated around Caesar, statues, titles, privileges once reserved for divine or semi-divine figures. To some Romans, this appeared as necessary stability. To others, it resembled monarchy in all but name. The memory of Rome's early kings, expelled centuries before to establish the Republic, lingered as a foundational myth. Fear of tyranny was embedded in political culture. Caesar's accumulation of honors, his centralization of command, and his visible dominance unsettled senators who believed they were witnessing the erosion of ancestral liberty. The paradox deepened. Caesar had defeated his rivals in the name of defending the Republic from oligarchic obstruction, yet his victory produced a concentration of power unprecedented in its history. Stability required authority, but authority threatened the very ideals it claimed to protect. Conspiracy emerged from this tension. A group of senators, some former allies, others long-standing critics, resolved that only his removal could restore balance. They framed their intentions not as personal vengeance, but as a defense of Republican tradition. On the Ides of March in the year 44 before Christ, within the Senate chamber, they struck. Caesar was stabbed repeatedly, falling at the base of Pompey's statue, a bitter symmetry in a conflict that had begun with rivalry and ended in shared ruin. The conspirators believed the act would revive the Republic's old equilibrium, that with the dominant figure removed, collective governance would reassert itself. Instead, the assassination exposed how profoundly the political landscape had changed. Caesar's death did not restore institutional balance. It unleashed further chaos. His supporters rallied, veterans demanded security, and new alliances formed around figures such as Mark Antony and Octavian. The Republic, already weakened by years of civil war, lacked the cohesive force necessary to absorb another shock. The very conditions that had elevated Caesar, personal armies, loyalty to commanders, the scale of empire, remained intact. Removing one man did not dissolve the structures that had produced him. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey had begun as a struggle over legality and command, but it ended by transforming the nature of Roman power. The Republic's mechanisms of balance had proven insufficient against the pressures of empire and concentrated military authority. Caesar's rise and fall revealed that the old framework could neither contain ambition nor survive its violent resolution. What emerged from the ashes would not be a restored republic, but a new political order shaped by the realities the Civil War had laid bare.